While I appreciate the value in being critical of art and media, there is this inescapable cynicism in a lot of the content the YouTube algorithm pushes. On the rare occasion that I tune into one of those big gaming live shows where a bunch of new projects get announced, it can be kind of sad to see all of the ZZZs and trash can emojis in chat at every non-established IP. But on the flip side, I can appreciate the serotonin boost that comes from watching people pop off at the things they do love. One type of project that always gets a huge reaction is a remake of a classic title. When people see an IP they know and love with a totally overhauled look, the internet loses its mind for a while. Now, of course, to say that video game remakes are universally beloved would be a lie, but the general vibe you get when a remake is announced runs the gamut between optimistic caution at worst and outright hysterical hype at best. What interests me here is that this is a far cry from the reaction you get when a remake of a movie is announced. Within the film industry, remake is almost like a dirty word, reviled by a large portion of moviegoers. A friend of mine put forward their claim that this has to do with the youth and immaturity of video games as a medium, positing that gamers are less likely to push for originality and new ideas. I then looked at the slew of double-digit season soap operas and ongoing book franchises that have been run into the ground for decades, and decided I didn't agree with that take. Video games are a very different medium from film or literature, and I think the conversation surrounding why people are so accepting of remakes here is a lot more complex than a lack of critical demand from fans. The nature of how games are made and the general culture around gaming makes game remakes a beast of their own. I'm not making this video to say game remakes are bad, nor am I defending them. Instead, I want to explore why they are so pervasive in the gaming industry, and a little bit about the impact they've had on games today, to figure out why we see them so differently from remakes of films. When you decide to remake a film, you're banking on the idea that the audience will be willing to experience the same story again, meaning that the performances, direction, and technology involved will have to set the newer iteration apart from the old. While they of course exist, film remakes that are as acclaimed as the original are very rare, and they are even rarer if you discount movies that are more so second attempts at adapting a book as opposed to a straight-up remake of an older film. When a movie ostensibly offers nothing new to the table but a different paint job, audiences don't tend to be kind about it. Just look at the reception of the new live-action Disney remakes, with the most common criticism being that there simply isn't a reason for them to exist. But a game's responsibility to its audience is not just in the narrative. Successive games are expected to build on gameplay as well as story, oftentimes more so. Pokémon has famously been doing remakes for decades, and the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color the first two generations came out on felt limited even in the 90s. As remakes, these weren't just billed as new versions, but instead as definitive versions. It isn't uncommon to see people encouraging new players to just play Heart Gold or Soul Silver instead of actually going back to the old Gen 2 games. This type of thing was especially common during the transitionary period that was the turn of the millennium. Video game tech evolved so massively in such a short period of time that it just felt natural to revisit games that were only a few years old to bring them up to the constantly changing modern standard. When you look at the sheer number of versions of the original Final Fantasy that exist, it becomes clear that these revisions weren't just built to offer new options, but in some cases to actively replace what came before. This type of thinking simply wouldn't fly in the world of film. Sure, we let people come in and make their 4-hour black and white director's cut once in a blue moon, but 99 times out of 100, if a director said they wanted to redo a movie they made 5 years ago while keeping the exact same script and performances, just messing with the effects and editing, no one would take that seriously. On a smaller scale, we saw what happened when George Lucas tried to add some CGI aliens and bad voice lines to Star Wars, leaving a majority of the experience identical. This attempt to replace what came before led to a fan frenzy that still exists today, given how hard it is to find untouched versions of the originals. It is a far cry from the attitudes you'd find in gaming, where there is seemingly this constant desire for old projects to be updated and retouched. Video games are a much more modular artistic medium. Devs can take one piece out, modify it, and put it back in without touching the rest, and it can still work. Because of this separation between gameplay and story, video game remakes aren't expected to totally overhaul both. Take the new MGS3 remake, for example. A lot of people are excited about the updated graphics and modernized gameplay additions, but the voice performances are going to be exactly the same. As far as cutscenes go, it looks like this is going to be a shot-for-shot remake with the original artistic vision pretty much entirely intact. Similarly, people were incredibly hyped for the Demon's Souls remake a couple years back, but it was firmly established that people just wanted it to look nicer above all else. With a game as mechanically precise as a FromSoft title, it was expected that Bluepoint's remake would keep certain attack animations and dodge timings the same, down to the frame. It's also worth noting that in the modern era, remakes are a way of adding accessibility. One of the more frustrating aspects of the games industry is how hard it can be to actually play these games. Had Demon's Souls never gotten a remake, it would still be trapped on the PS3 with no light at the end of that tunnel. Film and books don't get stuck on antiquated hardware in the same way. This isn't to say game remakes are only successful when they just change one piece of the puzzle. You can look at the Resident Evil remakes that have been released to a ton of acclaim, and they totally overhaul everything from gameplay style to story beats. However, games are allowed to separate the story and world building from the technology behind them, in ways that films are not. While a film remake has to be a complete do-over to have any value, games have more room to pick and choose how much of the experience people actually want to change. To announce a remake of a game invites praise. To announce a remake of a movie invites anxious caution. To announce a remake of a book would be blasphemous. Retellings of existing stories are rarely held in as high regard as original ideas, and that is when they are not legally suspect. A book is incredibly intimate, usually a window into a single person's narrative ideas. Every word was crafted by an individual whose name is on the cover. Ideally, at least. These stories are theirs and theirs alone, and you don't just revise these stories in your own words for money. A movie has a little less of this. We understand that a director handled everything from on high, and we see the craft of the actors playing these parts, but we also sit through 10 minutes of credits and understand that these are usually huge projects that employ hundreds of people to make them work. Even then, there aren't many art forms that advertise artistic integrity less than video games. Creators whose names rise above their creations, like Hideo Kojima, are a rare breed. It isn't a director's name you see on the cover of your game case, it's a publisher. Hopefully a developer too. If a film director said they planned to take another director's film and make a shot-for-shot remake, even reusing some of the original's resources, they would be dragged through the mud. Not only would they be seen as interfering with another person's artistic vision, but they would have also failed to present their own. The same is true of visual art and music. Cover bands and replica artists are rarely put in the same category as original creators. But a video game doesn't usually have an individual's creative reputation on the line like that. From a narrative perspective, as I said, MGS Delta is being advertised as if it will still be a product of Hideo Kojima in every way, with deviations existing only in gameplay and graphics, although even then, it's looking like the level design and mechanics are going to stay pretty similar. I have no idea who's directing this game. I don't even know if that's a sensible question to ask given the current structure of Konami and the nature of this remake. No one is being touted as the creative master of MGS Delta. It's being framed as Kojima's game, made with modern technology, and people seem pretty content with that. And again, Kojima is a unique case due to his reverence within the industry. You take something like the Dead Space remake, which very few individuals from the original team worked on, and complaints about authorship really don't come up at all, so long as the final product doesn't stray too far. Questions about artistic intentionality are oftentimes trumped by the joy of advancing technology. The further away from an author you get, the less pressure there is to maintain all aspects of the original creation. To change even one word of a classic novel could be seen as betrayal. But video games tend to be seen as a collective product, as opposed to an individual's artistic dream, and that gives them a lot more leeway to make changes. While I am pushing back against the idea that video game remakes are more widely accepted just because they are part of a newer medium, I do want to acknowledge that the culture around them is starting to shift a bit. Remaking an older game was always a welcome announcement in the past, but I have seen a lot more people questioning the need for them these days. The Last of Us Part 1 came out in 2022, 9 years after the original game. And I love The Last of Us Remake. I bought the game day one, and I was more than happy to do so. But there was a fair pushback against remaking the game in a way that was primarily a graphics boost with very minimal gameplay changes, and releasing it at full price. 9 years used to mean a lot in the world of gaming. It is the distance between Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy X. But these days, it is the difference between Metal Gear Solid 5 and Metal Gear Solid Delta. The race for graphical supremacy isn't what it used to be. As a result of games starting to plateau in terms of what is technologically visible to the player, I have noticed a lot more projects from people who actively want to utilize older gaming conventions that were once thought of as antiquated. We see games like Signalis and Octopath Traveler, where 90s-style graphics and mechanics are not just gimmicks, but aspects of the experience that add to the overall themes. It reminds me of the change film started going through at the start of the VFX craze. Some people thought that computer graphics would just get rid of practical effects entirely, but as that craze has died down, it seems the industry has learned the value of both in different ways. Fans certainly have. In a world where uncanny valley CGI, fixed camera angles, intentionally clunky mechanics, pixel art instead of 3D models, and many other once commonplace video game components are seeing a resurgence, there is also a more critical eye toward whether making old games newer and sleeker is actually in their best interest. The upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake is a great example. It has been very divisive online, and while a lot of that comes from the poor track records of publisher Konami and developer Bloober Team, the ways in which people have been picking apart the game is a pretty big jump from what I've seen in remakes before. But Silent Hill 2 is a weird game. Its eclectic performances, janky mechanics, and, at the time, innovative storytelling felt like lightning in a bottle, partway intentional, partway a wonderful accident that you can't really replicate. Now, I'm not trying to dogpile onto Silent Hill 2 Remake. I'll give it a chance, and the most recent story trailer was really cool. But there is less of a push to see older games as worse and in need of polish, and more of an appreciation for the artistic innovations that came from the tech limitations of the old days. It's not like gamers had never gotten on a remake's case for making too many artistic changes before. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes is 2 decades old now, and it saw a similar treatment. But again, Kojima has always had his own set of standards, and I can promise you that if MGS Delta wasn't using the same performances, we would be seeing a very different kind of reception. In today's day and age, we have games like Demon's Souls Remake, RE4 Remake, Last of Us Part 1, and Persona 3 Reload, and all of these games did fantastically well. I'm not putting them down in any way, but all of them did see discussions about whether or not they were properly doing justice to the original source material, in ways I didn't really see at that level before. As I mentioned at the start, the crux of what I'm talking about here isn't that remakes are good or bad, but simply that gaming as a medium is very different from other art forms. Even with this shifting perspective, video games will never be as remake-averse as other mediums. Their interactive nature and the evolving technology behind them set them apart. Opinions on remakes will likely continue to evolve, but if I had to guess, I don't think they will ever draw the ire that movie remakes tend to. When all is said and done, video games are not movies, and to treat them as such misses a lot about what makes them unique as such an influential medium in the modern world. That's all I've got for now. This video was something I kind of just put together on a whim when I was thinking about games and how they're made and why they're so different from movies and books, and I have some other ideas that branch off from that, but I am getting ahead of myself there. Let me know in the comments what your favorite remake is, of any medium. I'm curious to see what people are into. Otherwise, have a great day, and take care of yourself.